I'm Ellen Bince, coming today from Wheaton, Illinois, in the USA. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we can each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
And hello, I'm Clive Johnson, coming today from Leigh-on-Sea in the UK. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers and meditation, and go behind the headlines of a critical happening in our world that needs our attention right now.
In today's episode, we take one of these regular deep dives. Well, it's a little bit different deep dive to more fully understand and tune in with something or someone that many of us may know only a little about and see where we might hone in with our prayers and intentions. As we record, it's June 3rd, 2026.
Yeah. So you're literally just 1 day and 1 month away from the big 250 celebration, aren't you?
Yeah.
Get the
Yes.
bunting ready.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. So last week we took a look at what many Brits perceive about life in the USA. One really fascinating episode, I thought, as we sought to see through some common myths and remind ourselves of the challenge to test what others say and not rush to assumptions based on what we may hear in the news or read on social media. This week, nearly 10 years on from the Brexit referendum, we take up a seat on the US side of the pond as we ask what many Americans may think life in the UK is really like. While not able to be a perfect representative and certainly no defender, I'm certainly not a representative, certainly no defender or expert on the things we cover either, I will be taking on the role of eye on the ground this week as best I can. And as in our last episode, we'll open with some observations from Ellen's perspective about life in the UK, or what she thinks it is maybe like, before turning to a number of common notions that crop up in conversations among Americans on social media and in the news. As before, we'll try to include a few reflections that might get folks stateside saying of their transatlantic friends, do they really do that? Are they really like that? So fasten your seatbelts and enjoy. This is bound to be another quick-fire exchange of the perceived good, bad, and ugly. So before Ellen does put me under the spotlight, let me start by asking you some of the same sort of questions you asked me last week, but from an American perspective. What were your earliest impressions of the UK when you were growing up?
This is easy because I think that most Americans look to the UK, and I think I used this term last week, as our polite, kind, probably a little more upbeat big brother and sister. And I think in the US, the UK has a very positive reputation among us. Most people don't really remember when our country started, and Britain didn't really, the UK didn't really want us to do that. So that's doesn't seem like a big thing to us, but our perception is that you're, I think, a little bit more advanced than we are.
Really. Again, as we did last week, I'm very tempted to jump in and say, do they offer a view on that, which may be contradictory, but we'll hold off that for a while, because I think we're going to get into some of those questions.
Yeah.
It's an interesting perspective, really. And generally, so how has, do you think, perceptions of the UK from, or particularly the British, I perhaps should say, from the American side, have changed over the years? What do you think many Americans think about Brits in the UK today, if they have an opinion?
Yeah, I think a lot of Americans, when they think of the UK and Britain, they think most of the energy is focused on the royal family, to be honest with you. We have just an obsession with the royal family, especially all the Diana stuff and everything that went on then. And Harry and all that is, so when we hear about the UK, that takes a lot of energy from us. I would be willing to say, and I will poll my friends, that we don't even fully understand how your government works.
Mm, mm.
I also would assume that you hear a whole lot more about us than we hear about you.
Yes.
And it's just because people don't listen that much here. So I'm not saying that you're not important or anything. As you know, like when we travel to Europe and the UK, we're always amazed at how much other people know about our country that we don't either hear or take the time to hear. And I think that's definitely true in this case.
Mm. Interesting, interesting. Again, we may
Mhm.
come back to some of this a little bit later. So
Mhm.
just getting sort of penciling in a few initial thoughts.
Mhm.
And generally, how is the UK portrayed in the US media? And I know when we talk about the US media, it is, of course, quite a broad, polarized picture, as the media is here, of course. For example, is it seen as having a weak economy or no longer having much of a role to play on the world stage? And is it
Not at all.
seen as a friend or a reliable ally?
I don't think it's seen negatively at all, and definitely an ally. Most of us want the UK to be an ally. There, as things have happened recently, we hope we haven't alienated you, most of us. But yeah, it's portrayed positively. I I can't think of hearing anything negative except your struggles sometimes with your prime minister.
Mm,
And I think we admire your position on gun laws and how you handle that. When I visit London in England, I had a daughter who was in Oxford for a few years, so I got to
mm,
get over there.
mm, mm,
I
mm,
loved it, and felt like this was the beginning of our history, and everyone should go there. And everyone was so
mm, mm.
nice. So, gosh, I just can't think of negative press or negative things.
I must admit, I'm always proud of London. It's always been my city. I studied there. I lived there quite often for a while. I worked there for many years, and it's very close to where I am at the moment.
Mhm.
And it is my city, really.
You should be proud.
And I
Mhm.
do quite often when I come back from overseas feel a sense of pride about it. Actually,
Mhm.
there's obviously a lot you could say that could be improved, and there are problems and issues as with any mayoral kind of responsibility. But yeah, I think it does do well.
It does.
It does a good job in terms of I think being a pretty safe place in general and being a bit of a showcase actually.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yes, the history is stunning, I think, when go through the city. I feel like the diversity is now this is someone who's just there for a few
Mm,
days,
mm, mm.
but I love the diversity, and it feels like there's a wonderful acceptance of the
Yes.
diversity and embracing it. I'm a vegetarian, but I always have good food when I go there, which some people do say the food is not as good as in the States. I've not found that. I've found good
I
food.
think you've got to go to France and Belgium and Italy in Europe to make a good
Oh, no,
comparison.
I've had really
But
good food.
it depends what you like, of course. Yeah, I think another test for me, and this is just one small test, is when you come back. If you come to Heathrow Airport, for example, and you hop on the tube, or more likely there's a fast travel line. All of that compares very well with my experience in, say, getting from Charles de Gaulle to the centre of Paris, or
Mhm,
Jamaica Station near
mhm,
Kennedy Airport.
mhm.
So it's kind of a clean and efficient, and as it happens, we've got strikes on this week on the tube.
Yeah, oh,
But
well, we
usually,
won't
when
talk
it's
about that.
working, it
Yeah.
is a pretty good experience to a visitor. Just one little example. So again, I feel some pride there. I think. Mm.
Well, I think if you go to Boston, even New York City, you'll see that we replicated that. We tried to replicate that. You can see the history in some of our East Coast cities.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I only really well, I know the bus routes from Kennedy. If you get a coach, and there is a line that goes direct to Penn, isn't there? Which is the fast line, I think, Penn Station. But I've usually got the subway, and that involves getting a
Mhm.
shuttle from the terminal to I think it's
Mm, yeah.
Jamaica, and then
I don't know.
a long run on the subway.
Being a Midwest cornfield girl, I'm not the
Exactly.
best at all of that stuff,
And
subway stuff.
in Paris, it's what they call the RER. You will definitely be accosted by people wanting money before you
Mm.
get to the center.
We have that here. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, we're digressing.
So now we might turn to some specific themes. And for this, it's time for Clive to be our UK representative. I'm particularly interested in the things that many, or at least some, Americans think about Brits that cause them surprise or alarm, the kind of thing that gets your jaw dropping when you hear them. And we're generalizing, of course, but
Mm.
let's see whether we can get closer to the truth with many of these. So, generally, how do you think the UK is perceived by folks on my side of the pond?
It's interesting. Very interesting based on what you were saying earlier. My general perception is that there wouldn't necessarily be a very acute interest, a strong interest. It's kind of, it's over there, when there's a major news story, or as you say, perhaps a
Hmm.
big royal scandal or something like that, then there's a peak of interest. But generally speaking, I wouldn't think it's on the minds of a lot of ordinary Americans a lot of the time, or in the news. There's a wonderful fridge magnet, actually, my mother has, which I bought many, many years ago because it still has the Twin Towers on it of New York's view of the world. Or in fact, I think it was a Manhattan view of the world.
Hmm.
And it kind of showed mountain. It was sort of looking at the side of Manhattan Island, and beyond the skyscrapers, there was Brooklyn. That was kind of your next focus.
Yes,
There was
I know
Queens
this.
somewhere, another
Hmm.
little mountain. And then way in the background, there's lots of other little mountains. There's one that's Africa. There's one, there's one that's Europe. There's one that's Ireland.
Yes.
So it's kind of, that's the kind of sense I have. That's probably a little bit extreme, but very much the interest is what's going on at home, what's going on in other states, and possibly to some extent UK bundled in with, let's say, the rest of Europe.
I think, did you find when you were here, like as soon as you started speaking, people like, oh, you're from the UK,
I think
I
that used
we
to
love
be.
hearing that British accent.
It used to be the case. I mean, my experience, as I mentioned last week, I visited the US over many years, many times, and in different contexts and different places. So when I've been in quite remote areas off the beaten track for tourists, definitely. And I mean, certainly in my business experience, absolutely never, we're talking all the time and
Hmm.
on absolutely. If you're in big multinational companies, there's no interest there in strange accents. It's very common. In cities like New York, I've not noticed that at all.
No?
In recent, no. Again, very international,
Yes.
lots of tourists, nothing unusual. So no, I think it's possibly been when I've been hosted by people who may be less, don't know so many folks from the UK,
Hmm.
or in some of these more remote places I've been to.
Okay. All right. Well, you would be here in Wheaton, Illinois. People would say, oh,
I do wonder if Wheaton. I was reflecting on this, or very near Wheaton. I think I used to come on business a few times, 3 or 4 times. I used to come to Chicago,
hmm.
and I used to arrive late on a Sunday, pick up a car, which is not a good thing when you've been on a flight, and in terms of your body
Yes.
clock, it's after midnight. And I used to go south and west a bit. And I think it was I-80 or 88, somewhere like
I-88. Yes,
that.
that's very
And
close to me.
I just I remember that road going into the center of Chicago. You'd eventually get to where there was a railway going down the middle.
Hmm.
And it would end up near going under the stock exchange building.
Oh, yes, that's
And
that's the Eisenhower.
so that was kind of what was on my mind. But I used to stay some distance, I'd say 15 miles maybe, from where the railway started, pretty much
Okay.
close to that road.
You probably were close to me.
So
Hmm.
yeah, I think it's your
Yeah.
but I was staying in a Marriott or goodness knows what else.
Yeah.
It was just straight to the hotel.
Okay.
Anyway,
So let's get to the question of politics, because why not?
Yeah.
Since the time of Brexit, which I have to admit, many of us shook our heads like we didn't understand the whole
No.
Brexit
No.
situation. That was 10 years ago.
Yes. Yes.
The UK has had no less than 6 prime ministers, and the current incumbent in number 10, Sir Keir Starmer, it's likely to face a leadership battle very soon. Is
Mm,
that true?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It seems that British politics and the two main parties, Labour and Conservative, and I don't even know if many Americans know the two parties,
Mm.
are in total turmoil. And so what's going on?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think what's really going on has been going on for quite some time, and I think Brexit was a part of this. I think the UK, like many countries, has real structural problems. We have, like many countries, an aging population, so the welfare bill is going up. The state pension and healthcare and so on. And whilst there's a certain amount of tax paid, and obviously older, retired people are contributors in terms of buying services and so on, the actual wealth generation is pretty weak compared with what it was. Very reliant, the UK, compared with other European countries, on financial services. The City of London, which itself is facing a lot of competition, much more so than it did in previous years, and other service industries. There's still a degree of manufacturing. There are still some car producers and pharmaceutical companies and so on, but it's not a big industrial nation at all. And the traditional industries, and of course energy production, mining, and all that kind of thing is long
Mm-hmm.
gone. So there are serious structural problems, and it for quite some time has been hitting people's pockets. The level of disposable income they have, the price of living, cost of living,
Mhm.
has just been a real worry. There are huge problems, again, not unique to the UK, with the younger generation, especially. That also has come about over the last 20 years, where since the time I went to uni, when I went to uni, it was probably 15-20% of school leavers would go down that route. And I was incredibly blessed. I had a full grant.
Oh,
I,
nice.
I didn't have a loan. And then there was a view that everyone who wants to should have the opportunity. So a lot of emphasis was suddenly put on the opportunity to go onto further education.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, there was not really much emphasis put on traditional apprenticeships into
Mm-hmm.
traditional trades and so on. The kind of academic route was very much emphasized, which even in professions like nursing, it was more
Mm-hmm.
important to have a degree than perhaps the aptitude to be a good nurse. And I personally think this was crazy. But
Nursing doesn't require a degree.
no, exactly. But it does now, in order to go into
Yes.
that profession and to have any kind of career opportunity. And that's just one example. So a lot of skill has been lost. A lot of emphasis, the educational emphasis, has gone wrong, in my view. And students have ended up with heavy loans. And we are in an economy where jobs are in very short supply. And we are facing challenges of, how is AI going to impact
Mm-hmm.
on all this and so on. So there are huge, huge problems, big concerns which were really played up by certainly the right wing media, the tabloid press, especially, which has a strong influence around the so-called threat of immigration, which has continued and is still very strong. That played into the Brexit argument quite a lot.
Uh-huh.
We are.
Oh, so immigration was a factor in Brexit?
It was. I mean, not the only one. There were people who would vote for Brexit where that would not necessarily have been an issue, but it certainly was for the Leavers campaign quite a significant focus, and continues to be. The
Well,
crazy
how
thing.
did they okay, so I'm a little bit lost. So the people who wanted to leave, the European Union.
Mm.
The world wanted to leave because of immigration, but how did leaving change your immigration system?
Well, I'd have to say not all of them did. There were there's a mixed reasons people wanted to leave. And one other big factor for a lot of people was the idea we want sovereignty. We don't want to be governed by crazy European regulations.
Because
And
you were usually the leader in history.
exactly. And there was this sense of take back control kind of thing.
Hmm.
So that was another big one, and we can do better alone in negotiating. I mean, this was crazy, very poor debate. Or, well, the idea that you can be a stronger power in your negotiating trade deals and so on your own, but that was another idea I think that people had, among other things. Yeah, migration important because small island. The idea is with these problems I was mentioning, unemployment and how many people can you accommodate? The fact
Right.
is, migration is critical. You need people to bring skills and indeed to do jobs that many local people are not happy doing.
Yes.
And there has even been a net reduction recently under the Labour government, I think, in migration. It's not highlighted, is not known to most people. Because the UK is separated by water from Europe to get here, those who chance their luck, as it were, as asylum seekers, often make very dangerous journeys over water.
Mm-hmm.
And that's happening all the time. So there's a very serious problem there to address. But yeah, the whole thing around we're too small, we don't need more people, we'll do it all ourselves, and our problems will be solved is very naive and wrong, actually.
Do you think there will be at any point you'll rejoin the EU?
Well, interestingly, this discussion is just potentially beginning to come back on the agenda, although no politician is going to go near it seriously for many years because it's too divisive and would
No,
not be
still.
seen. Still, yes, too divisive. But because the current prime minister there's not actually a leadership race yet, but could be within weeks. One of the factors there is that one of the preferred candidates has to come back into parliament, and there's a by-election in a couple of weeks' time, which he would have to win.
Mm,
And what happens after that, I think, is that there could well be a leadership race because Starmer is not regarded as someone that can win the next election for the Labour
hmm.
Party. I think it's personally sad. I think he's a good prime minister in many ways, but hasn't communicated well, and there've been
Hmm.
mistakes. And he's also created certain sort of restricted what he can do in terms of what they promise in the manifesto regarding taxing and so
Yeah.
on. So there've been some big mistakes, but I think it'd be another. I really do think it's a mistake for changing a leader every couple of years when things
Yes.
aren't going well. That's not a good approach. But yeah, Brexit, kind of the failings of Brexit to some extent have been concealed by the fact we've had a pandemic
Hmm. Oh, yeah.
along with everybody else. And there've been some, there've been some things happening, I guess, that kind of means excuses can be
Right.
put on other things. There's no doubt in my mind that it was a disastrous decision, but I think it's very unlikely, sadly, even with these new leaders, with these leadership contenders, one potentially beginning to raise this question, that it will be back on the agenda to rejoin for a long time. And if we rejoin, we've got to do so from a position of strength, negotiation wise with Europe. We will not have such a good deal. The UK, this is one of the crazy things, had exemptions from when he was a member of the EU. It kept its own currency, of course.
Hmm.
So its own central bank was still able to control interest rates and so on. And we had exemptions around a number of different policies, and our borders were strongly patrolled. We weren't a member of the free zone, the so-called Schengen zone within Europe, where you don't need a passport. So, in fact,
So whose idea was this? What Brexit was a far right idea, right?
it was really. There's one politician, a name you probably know in the States, Nigel Farage. He's a Trump supporter, and he has headed up various parties. The current one is called Reform,
Okay.
which is very, very popular to the extent that it could be a king or queen maker, or indeed the dominant party at the time of the next election. It is incredibly
So
popular.
I don't know the answer to. I need help on this. Sometimes I think that the UK is liberal, and sometimes I think it's conservative, and it goes kind of back and forth. It doesn't seem like it goes drastically either way back and forth. Am I wrong, or can you help me understand?
Yeah, well, traditionally, two main parties. Well, in the 20th century, at least. I mean, before then, there
Yes.
was a very strong liberal party, more of a centrist party. The Labour Party was formed 1920s, very much pro-workers,
Yes.
socialist kind of approach. It was what the Labour Party was responsible for National Health Service and
Mhm.
generally
Oh, they were? Oh.
higher taxation for the rich and more socialist ideals,
Mhm.
strong trade union movement support, and so on. Conservative Party, very ancient, very old party, generally regarded, or traditionally used to be regarded, as a safe pair of hands financially for good
Mhm.
stewardship. And indeed, if you earned money, it was kind of laissez-faire. You get the rewards. You're
Yes.
a bit entrepreneurial and so on. You take risk.
Capitalism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but still with a fairly broad church. That was how it used to be. So it was,
Uh-huh.
had a bit of a within it. There were some who were much more right wing, much more capitalist, if you like, and there were those
Mhm.
tended more
Sure.
towards
Just
liberal.
like here,
That was
our
the way it was.
Republican, Democrat, yeah.
That all changed. Well, Labour started changing with the Blair government. That became much
Mhm.
more centrist. And Tony Blair, actually, by the way, has written an essay last week on what he thinks the future for his own party is and have a strategy as the basic, have a vision. What are you doing with AI and so on?
Yeah.
But he very much still supports the idea of Labour being a more liberal, I guess you'd call it, centrist,
Mhm.
not unlike the old centrist Conservative Party. So, rewards for those who work hard and sort of more liberal taxation policies than more of a socialist move. And that's the way the Labour Party came, although there was a bit of a distraction for a long period around the time of the Brexit vote when there was a socialist leader in charge,
Mhm.
and it was almost blowing itself apart, the party at that point.
Okay.
Conservatives have really gone off the rails since, well, before Brexit, and they have become much more right wing and
Mhm.
chasing essentially those who have gone to this reform party.
Mhm.
It's become quite nasty with some of their ideologies and because of this, I think people are not aware of what the parties represent anymore, what their vision is. And so the more extreme parties like Reform, who have
Mm.
charismatic leaders who
Mhm.
promise all sorts of things, as they did with Brexit, we were going to have a new hospital built every week from the money saved contributed to the
Oh.
EU, for example. And also the Greens, interestingly, they have a very popular leader and appealing particularly to the younger generation. Suddenly they are really splitting the vote. And in the middle of the Liberal Democrats, you kind of also have a degree of support, but what they're about is not so clear either. So it's a very messy picture.
Well, it
Right.
doesn't sound that different from what we're doing.
But
So,
radical politics, that's the thing, as we know.
yeah,
Right.
radical
This is
politics.
what
Yeah.
people are going for, and especially when the media is shouting for them. Yeah,
Yeah.
pushing their cause.
That right. So, if I may, since you put me under the spotlight last week, I'd like to hear a few of your quick fire thoughts on
Mm.
odd comments we sometimes hear on radio talk shows and in general conversation over here. So, as we did last week, I'll phrase these as statements that you might have a word or two to say in response to, as to whether they're likely true or far away from reality, how this hits you. I remember some last week.
Hmm.
I was like, what? I've never heard that. Okay. So
I'll try and be brief.
now, yeah, I have not particularly heard this one. I think this is definitely on the if it's anywhere, it's on the very conservative news stations that there's Sharia law in London and the city is a dangerous place to be and Londoners' freedoms are restricted like never before. I personally have never heard this, but I mean I have heard it, but I don't believe it. Tell me about this.
No. It's certainly a number of commentators on some of the right wing press in the US I know have
Yes,
said this. And it does. It's absolutely false. Absolutely false.
I think so.
We have a mayor who is a Muslim, and I think personally I like him as a mayor. I think he's a good
Hmm.
mayor, and he's since the first term of Trump has not been the greatest supporter of your incumbent to the White House, and
Really?
I mean his job is campaigning for London essentially, and the stewardship
Hmm.
of the capital's finances. And I think he does a pretty good job in the main, personally. No, and as we've said in a previous episode ourselves, we looked into the stats, didn't we, around violent
Yes.
crime in major cities of Western cities. London has one of the best safety records in the world.
I always feel safe there.
Yeah,
I didn't even know I wasn't supposed to feel safe.
homicide
Yeah.
rates, serious assault and so on.
Yeah.
They've actually been falling. I mean, yes, they occur, of course they do, but the rates are less than most other European and American cities. So London is I was actually talking to a friend from Canada who's coming over this in a week, and she said that Canada has an advisory against terrorism in the UK at the moment, is very high, and advising against. I couldn't understand what on earth is this
Hmm.
about. Yes, there've been attacks on some synagogues, and because the world's in a fairly volatile state at the moment, I guess everywhere there is a heightened
Yes.
risk. But I just couldn't understand this.
Okay, good. I'm glad we cleared that up.
Yeah.
Now, this is one we do here. Healthcare is free for everyone, no limits. And the government assigns you a doctor and controls every treatment. So we hear about socialized medicine has its positives because our healthcare system is so messed up. And yet we hear some of the bad things too.
Yep. Yep.
And not sure which outweighs
Yeah.
what.
I mean, the government doesn't control. That's for sure. In terms of being assigned a GP, it depends on the local arrangement. So when you move into an area, or you're born in an area or whatever, you will register with a local practice, and they will have, to some extent, have quite a lot of discretion really in how they operate. Most, and certainly my experience, operate what's called a triage system. So whereas previously,
Mhm.
when I was young, a long time ago, yes, you would be assigned a GP who knew you and your history and your family, would turn up with a stethoscope and whatever.
Yeah.
That is a long gone notion for most people.
Well, if you suspect that you have, let's just use an example. You suspect you have a sinus infection.
Hmm.
What do you do? And how quickly are you treated?
There are different ways of doing it. There is a phone number that you can call, which is an NHS national number, and there will be someone that kind of talks through a certain level of diagnosis online, and they're not qualified as doctors, or of course are not able to diagnose, but they will get to the point where they say, well, we think you need to go to the emergency room, to A&E as we call it, accident and emergency, or you need to go and see your GP quickly.
Okay.
Or they very often will be able to suggest things that you can do. And so that is kind of like the first line if you had something like sinus, or alternatively, you would book to go and see your local practice. And
And
they
would you
then
get in right away?
again, it's going to depend on the individual practice. There are serious
Okay.
problems with waiting. Often getting an appointment can not be done within a day unless
Uh-huh.
it's a real emergency. So there are stories of people struggling to get appointments,
That's
and
not really different from the way that it is here with
uh,
private
the real
healthcare.
delays come with referrals. Once you're referred on to a specialist consultant tied to a hospital, depending on what it is, and again, if it's a real emergency, then hopefully you're going to be seen pretty quickly. But there can be some severe delays, and often cancellations of different kinds of operations. They can take months in
Yeah.
the National Health Service. And getting a place in hospital can be, again, unless it's an absolute emergency, you really are dying, for all sorts of things. There is just a lack of beds, and there's a real
Mhm.
problem with the flow of people leaving hospital who need onward
Mm-hmm.
care,
Yep.
which backs up to the point of being taken by ambulance. So
Yeah.
there's huge backlogs, and yeah, the health system has been regarded as being essentially broken for a long
Mm-hmm.
time. Having said that, there are good experiences as well. It's not, you know, it depends very much on the hospital, the condition you have, the situation at the moment in terms of how many beds are. But yes, absolutely, there needs to be investment. And consequently, a lot of people do invest who can afford it, do have private insurance, which will mean they
Mm-hmm.
see queues and so on, and will be able to see private doctors and so on. Many
Doesn't
people,
sound that different from what we experience.
no, it probably isn't. Probably
Yeah.
isn't. Yeah.
Okay, so here's a good one. The UK Parliament can do what it likes with no real checks and balances. And I'd like to add that I don't even really understand what the UK Parliament does. So you have the Prime Minister and then you have the Parliament underneath the Prime Minister, right? Or is it like in our country, we have, the three divisions of government. Are they supposed to provide the checks and balances to the Prime Minister? And then do you have a third? Like we have the Supreme Court, Congress, and the executive
Yeah.
branch. Is
Well,
it like that?
no, it is a very strange system. And there's no written, can you believe this? No written constitution.
What?
Yes, no written constitution. The Houses of Parliament, there are two parliaments. There's the House of Commons, which is the lawmaker. And that's where our representatives, our members of parliament are, where the prime minister, the government, and the opposition and the other parties are debating. And, essentially, they are ultimately responsible for lawmaking. There is a kind of check and balance in a second house called the House of Lords. We could spend a lot of time talking about that, but it's quite an archaic organization. There's for a long time been, a lot of people wanting there to be reform. Some of the people in there are there because of hereditary,
Oh, wow.
and there's things like bishops. And the idea is it's got a good mix of representative business people and experts and so on who can challenge lawyers, of course, who can challenge legislation that is proposed when it's going through its.
So it's not elected.
It's
It's
not
appointed?
elected. It can delay. It can push back to the House of Commons on a proposed bill, suggested amendments. So it can delay. And there have been some controversial delays. One of them quite recently is around assisted dying bill,
Mm-hmm.
which seemingly it's used its power to really almost quash that. But that is a kind of, it's not really a check and balance. The justices, the Supreme Court, they do have a degree of power around interpreting law. And indeed, in some cases where I don't think it happens very often, but where there isn't a law, they will make a judgment. So there is a kind of,
Mm.
and I guess there would be certain things if the government overstretched its power where the court could potentially intervene. There's no executive in the way there is in the US in terms of the president making executive orders. The prime minister has a lot of power, but he is subject, or she is subject to parliament. He is regarded, I say he because it's mainly been male. There have been three.
Because right now it's a he.
It is, yeah. So I'm thinking of him at the moment. But
Mm-hmm.
they can, in the case of Blair, for example, he essentially
Mm-hmm.
took the country to war
Mm-hmm.
with Iraq. So and they have the nuclear codes. They have power,
Okay.
but they are called the first among equals. In other words, in theory, decisions are made by a cabinet, government, and law is made by the Houses of Parliament, and it needs a majority votes.
The Commons and the Lords have to vote?
Well, it's the Commons that will produce the legislation, and they will do the initial vote, but then the Lords they're the ones that will push back and
Okay.
potentially delay and maybe have some amendments made along the
Okay.
way, sometimes usefully.
So it's my supposition that the House of Lords is probably, does it have representation from the working class, from someone who is not wealthy, or is it mainly your elites?
Well, it's mainly the elites. I mean, in theory, it does have good representation of people that have, there will be
Mhm.
some who'll make a good contribution in terms of what their
Mhm.
experiences and so on, and come from different backgrounds. But no, it is a bit of a club, frankly,
Yeah.
and continues to be. And that's where a lot of criticism comes.
Mhm.
A lot of former MPs will end up there. It's kind of like an honor, really. You get a
Okay.
title with it as well. You become a lord or a
What about the ratio of men and women?
more men,
Oh,
quite significantly.
surprise. Mhm.
Yeah. I think there's been attempts to change that because the government's propose, new people come. I think there's been an attempt to change that in recent years, but it will take time because once
And
you're
are
in,
they on there in the House of Lords? Are they on there until they die,
yes,
or do they retire,
no,
or
they're there
do they
until they
leave?
die. They're
Oh,
there until
geez.
they die. It's crazy. It is crazy.
Yeah.
Um, so, but it's kind of always been one of these things. Oh, there's better, there's other priorities to deal with before we
Yes.
get into this debate about reform. It's the same with the reform of the electoral system, where we have a
Uh-huh.
so-called first past the post system. Is not too different in some senses to the electoral school system, in that basically within a seat, an area, a constituency, the person that gets the majority wins that seat. So you
Yeah.
do not necessarily end up with a representative parliament. The Labour Party, which currently has a huge majority of members of parliament in the House of Commons, I think this government was only elected in by 20% of the population. So there'll be a lot of,
Oh.
let's say, minority parties who are not represented according to, the number of people who actually voted for them, but, in different
So your
constituencies.
voter turnout, like us, is often low. Is that what you're saying?
It can be low, but basically it's a bit like the electoral, Florida has however many.
Yeah.
Well, if Republicans win even a, two or three majority for
Yes.
each of those, once they get to their 10
Mhm.
election seats or whatever,
Yes.
they hold that state. It's kind of that kind of
Okay. I
system,
understand.
really. Yeah.
I have to ask a quick question. And what is up with those white wigs in the history? Like that doesn't happen anymore, I'm sure, but why did they
With
wear those
lawyers,
wigs?
or
Yeah. Lawyers and I mean in the movies we see these white wigs all the time.
I think that's a protocol. I don't know. I think it's a protocol in the legal profession, and I think it dates back to the time when 17th century or whenever, when there was a lot of disease and hair lice and all sorts of things like that, and these powdered wigs apparently were ways.
Silly.
I think it is one of these bizarre
Yeah.
conventions that has
We
just.
don't have to spend a lot of time, but I've always wondered what
I I
the
could be
heck?
wrong there, but that's what I understand. And there's lots
Yeah.
of these silly little conventions that have never been repealed, or they just carry on because they're conventions and tradition, people would call them.
I definitely think we have a misconception of the role of the king and the royal family in
Mm.
the UK. How much power do they have? What, do they have any influence in the parliament or House of Lords or with the prime minister?
No, they are not, as was the case historically. The absolute monarch of the past could really take decisions, but even then, since the time of James I, there was strong opposition from Parliament. But it's been a long time, many years since the monarchs have had real power. They are not involved in, let's say, the big decisions of state. They are the representative. They are the head of state in name, essentially. And I kind of like it because you do not. I always liken it to like you imagine an organization chart that needs a box at the top, but the person occupying that box is not a dictator. They do not have real power. Individually, the prime minister will brief and talk to the monarch, I believe, on a weekly basis, typically, and they may well take counsel from them as someone who is kind of independent and may have a view. But essentially, it is the government that is taking all decisions. And yes, they have soft power, I think. That is the role, another big role for the monarchy. So the King's visit, Camilla's visit to the US recently, very good from a PR, diplomatic, softening
Mm-hmm.
relations kind of thing, getting away
Mm-hmm.
from politics, and the ceremonial aspects and traditional history, of course, is a big appeal for a lot of tourists, basically, as
Well,
well.
yes, yes.
So,
Okay, so I would think that the royalty has to stay in the center. They can't really declare
yep, exactly.
who they're for or
Yep.
against. But it would also be a hunch that you can kind of tell by how they comport themselves and what they do, that you probably can glean where their political leanings are. Is that true?
Well, with Charles, because of course he did have a lot of interest, and when he was prince, he was at liberty to align himself with different causes and so on. So I think it's well known really what a lot of his views are. But yes, it's a case of once you are in that position, you do not express an opinion, and that would be picked up very quickly by the media.
Mhm. Right.
There's strong pushback on that.
It
Um,
is known that your media is brutal.
yeah,
I think that's a reputation that we definitely know happens.
it is.
Like what happened with Harry and Meghan and Diana and
Exactly. Absolutely appalling cases of phone hacking and
Mhm.
harassment and essentially telling lies and kind of getting away with it. And yeah, it is not, I mean, especially the newspaper media, I would say, more than anything else. It is definitely not something that I think we can be proud of. This,
Because on the other hand, the BBC is very well respected here. Like if you really want to hear the news, listen to the BBC. We feel like they are very balanced and are telling the news of the world as opposed to what we hear. Is that true?
well, I have my own view on the BBC. I mean, yes, they have a charter and a responsibility to not be biased. It takes the form very often of when we've got someone expressing a strong view, we need to get someone expressing the opposition, even if they're strongly in a minority, and almost give them, equal attention. I think a lot depends on individual journalists, but they're bound by a responsibility to be balanced. I personally like the World Service, the BBC, a lot, partly because it is local based journalists in different who know their country, and
Mhm.
that's kind of where I tend to go for my news with the BBC. Or there are particular journalists who have a very good insight into
Mhm.
particular issues. But it's an unusual service, and it's paid for. If you have a TV, you have to have a license. You have to pay
Mhm.
a certain amount each year, but there's no advertising. There's no commercials. And so again, that I guess arguably keeps it independent. It has a certain structure that's meant to maintain that independence. I think it's an organization that needs serious reform. It doesn't always spend its money very wisely. Its original mission was, what was it? Inform, entertain, educate, or something like that. I can't remember. And I think it does some of those things well. There are some services that it provides to a degree that probably would be more easily cut, would be killed if they were purely, it was down to commercial concerns.
Mhm.
So look, there's still a degree of local radio
Yeah.
provision, for example. That's been heavily threatened in recent years. But some of the things like that are definitely worth keeping, in my view.
Mm.
But I think in terms of it,
Equivalent to our PBS, I think.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So it's
Right.
all in all, I think it's generally a good thing to have
Yeah.
that.
Maybe a little more
Yeah,
centrist than
yeah,
our although
exactly.
I love PBS. So, um, and here's a good one. Because the police don't carry arms, they're basically powerless. Now, I have not heard that they're powerless. I I don't really think that. I think you have a better handle on gun control than we
Well,
do. That's
we do,
that's the bottom line.
and certainly some police are, that is their role. They're specially trained and in anti-terrorist situations and so on. There are armed police that can be brought onto into a situation. No, I don't believe they're powerless at all.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not all going around hitting people with a truncheon, and it's not that kind of situation there. They can come out in force. They have tasers if they need it. They've got riot gear and all kind of things like that. But it's not something I've ever considered to be an issue. um,
Okay. Here's another one. Immigration has really changed the UK. Is that true?
I think going back to what we said earlier, personally, I think it's changed it for the better.
Mhm.
Um, and you know, but the migration issue, as we were saying earlier, it is a very sensitive topic. It's true that world migration patterns
Mhm. Mhm.
are
Right.
a
It's all
huge,
countries. Oh,
all
yeah.
countries. It's a huge problem to be addressed at
Right.
a global level, really, or international level. And there isn't really, as far as I can see, any kind of coordinated international effort to do that. So yes, it is a problem, but in that sense, but no, in terms of where we are at the moment, I'm not on the side of those who are quite quickly
Wanting to
get to the
limit it.
point of
Yeah.
yeah.
So here's another Britain is an aged imperial power whose days of glory are long over, yet still delusionally believes itself to be important and some kind of power on the world stage. Now, I have to tell you where this affects me is Canada, where I see the Queen's face on their money and I think, oh, for the love of God, get over it. I mean, how does the power of little UK spread to the whole of Canada? And, you hear so many islands that, they were ruled by the Britons, even India and like,
Yes,
uh,
Australia, New Zealand, yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Yep, yep.
give it up.
Yeah, I know there've been referendums in Australia, and
Mhm.
for example, and I think there's another one potentially on the cards, and been more of a movement, as I understand, among Australians towards Republican, becoming a republic. I think probably they'll come back to thinking, well, let's just keep the status quo. Again, this idea of this powerless guy at the top, really. We need a head of state. Is it better having someone that's not got any power or having a president who knows, we've got 3 or 4 years of to deal with? So I think, again, that's where a lot of the Commonwealth countries are. Britain certainly doesn't regard itself as having any, the vast majority of Britons would regard themselves as having any right to kind of an imperial attitude towards other countries anymore. That's long gone.
Do you
Uh,
give these people money? Do you give money to Canada, Australia? Do you help
no,
support them?
no, I don't think so. Although I think there are claims that can be made from countries that were abused by the UK
Well,
during its
yeah.
imperial
Okay.
days.
Yes.
So historically, there was quite a strong aid program and development program for developing countries that included a lot of former imperial.
Mhm.
They became part of the Commonwealth and so on. In terms of Britain's role, it does still pull a punch above its size and weight. Really,
Well,
it's
good.
obviously
I
got
mean,
a
how did you even have enough people to dominate all of this landmass geography around the world? It's kind of amazing
well, some of
when you
it's
think about it.
historical. So, after the Second World War, when the UN came to be, we were one of the allies. So we had a right to a permanent seat on Security Council, that kind of thing. And British economy is still in the G7, not only the G8. We're still one of the strongest economies in the world. Next to the dollar and the euro, the pound and the yen are the strongest go-to investment currencies in the world.
Mhm.
The City of
Mhm.
London is still the centre for marine trade and insurance. There's a lot that's still, global functioning is still influenced and comes to London, essentially.
Well, that's,
And
so do you feel like all the power is in London of the UK? That's where the seat
yeah,
of the power
it
is?
is it's one of these models, and it's the same in France with Paris. London has far more power than
Mhm.
all the other major cities put
Mhm.
together. There have been various attempts to devolve, government departments, to move them to different places and to give more power to the mayors of big cities and counties, a degree of devolution, which is certainly quite strong in terms of, the power that Scotland has, for example.
Mm.
But yeah, London is still by far, in terms of the economy, in terms of where people headquarter themselves from overseas, far the dominant city, and it's not regarded as being a good model.
Well, speaking of that, I watched something recently that explained the difference between when you say England, the UK,
Mm-hmm.
or like what can you give us a 30-second tutorial on how one should refer to I don't even know how I should what's the politically correct
There
thing to
are
say or
what the different there are different definitions of countries or states, but I think according to the UN definition, which is the widely accepted one, Scotland and England are countries. Northern Ireland is a province, and Wales is a principality. The British Isles is a geographical term which includes the whole of Ireland. It's the islands all around the UK and Wales, and Ireland, essentially.
why isn't it called Ireland? Why is it called British Isles?
It's British Isles purely geographical, like you might call Himalayas a range of mountains. So it's not anything
Mhm.
to do with the country, and it does include, as I say, islands as well. The UK is Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England, run from Westminster. What the devolved country of Scotland has, and to a lesser extent, there's a degree of independence for Wales and Northern Ireland,
Why not
is
Southern Ireland?
Southern Ireland has been independent, completely its own nation, completely separate from Westminster since the late 19, sorry, the, when was it, 1916, 1918, something around that time they had independence. So that's well over 100 years now. Westminster still is responsible for foreign policy, for defense, and key fiscal policy, so taxation. So those three things are still UK control.
All the UK.
Yeah.
Okay.
But Scotland, for example, will have a lot of control over how is educational curriculum and its, I don't know, how it allocates its resources financially and
Is there any
the legal
similarity between
system.
those differences as our federal and state governments?
They kind of
Is it
come from the
kind of the same
same.
thing?
They come from the same root, really. Or
Mhm.
well, a lot of it does for a long time. I mean, Scotland was split
Mhm.
off from England before the 17th century as well. So, but I think all the modern law and so on pretty much stems from that
Mhm.
period. So yes, there will be an awful lot of overlap. And I guess these big things, the foreign policy, the defence, the ultimately the revenue.
Hmm.
Those are really the
It's all the
things that are
UK.
still in the UK. Yeah.
UK. Okay.
Mm. And UK has other dependencies, little islands like the Channel Islands, like the Isle of Man,
Mhm.
and various other
Mhm.
places that, again, for those things, defence and so on, they look to Westminster.
Okay. Thank you for that little tutorial. I I- I'll try to keep that straight. I don't know if many of us know that over
No,
here,
but
all those
probably when
details.
people talk about being British, they mean
Yes.
UK as opposed to Irish, even though British Isles is a geographical term embracing Ireland as well.
Okay. Yeah.
It's
See,
confusing. It is
now, yeah,
confusing.
I'm confused again.
If you're
Now I'm
Irish,
back
you
to where
want
I
to call
started.
yourself Irish. You want to be proud of your Irish
Yes.
heritage.
I don't know. I think you guys need to get some things straightened out.
You do.
But finally, as the UK approaches the 10th anniversary since Brexit in just a few weeks' time, which I can't believe it's been 10 years,
Yeah.
what are the things that, as a UK citizen, you hope for in the next 10 years?
I think I generally want some of what I read. I mean, I agree with some of it, and I disagree with some of it. When I read the essay. It's online. Tony Blair's kind of strategy, his words for the Labour Party, but I think for other parties as well. Really, we need a vision. We need to be clear about geopolitics changing. I mean, in his view, we should still be very strongly aligned, strong allies of the US, almost come what may, which is controversial. But
Oh,
looking at
good luck.
looking at the geopolitics of where we are outside of Europe, outside not being a member of the EU, personally, I would want us to become much more closely realigned with Europe, even if we do not go back into the EU. I would love to go back into the EU personally, but I can't see that happening. And I don't, as I said earlier, I don't think we would have quite the same arrangement we had previously. I'm concerned about young people, the young generation, and particularly, again, these are not UK specific, but what are our strengths as a nation? Typically, we've been a very innovative nation. You know, the leaders in the Industrial Revolution, inventors of goodness knows how many things that the world uses today. And there's still a lot of clever people coming out of, you know, the education here is very good in the STEM subjects, for example. But can that be translated into becoming a world power on that stage? At the moment, for things like AI and a lot of IT, we are dependent on the US, believe it or not, for server capability. The actual cost of running huge servers is massive, and the investment.
Yeah.
I would like us to really, really buck up our ideas with energy and to go heavily nuclear. There are a few nuclear power stations being not built, but I think there's one or two smaller ones being built, but they come to their age where they need renewal and so on of the reactors. But we are way behind. And I am ashamed of our infrastructure, particularly railways. I won't go into the high-speed network, but it is a complete and utter embarrassment, largely down to capitalists and personal interests and planning permissions and regulation and mismanagement and all sorts of things. It's just inconceivable. When I look at Japan, Japan is a very good comparison country. As a country that doesn't quite get on with its neighbors. It's an island nation. It's a very strong financial economy. It's got the same structural problems. I look at their railway system, for example.
Yes,
with
it's fantastic.
envious eyes. I look to France or Germany or Turkey or Spain, and it's appalling. So I'd like to think we do better with because we have the capability. It's just the pure regulation and the so-called NIMBY, not in my backyard. You know, the planning permission that pushes things through consultation after consultation. And I hope we become stronger there. But yes, really working out how are we going to, what are our strengths industrially in terms of our services, and there's things to be hopeful for. The UK, believe it or not, at the moment, again, it doesn't get shouted about, is the slightly strongest growing nation in its economy in the G8.
Wow. That I did not know that. That is good piece of news for you.
Yeah. And whilst it's high, unemployment is kind of lower than in other economies. So it's, we don't hear about these things because, of course, we hear everything these extreme parties want us to know is wrong about Britain.
Yep. Well, I think this has been really fascinating because my ending thought is we're really more similar than we are different.
Yes.
You know, we're dealing with the same problems, though your structure is so different from ours. And, you know, the fact that you don't have a constitution and your political structure is different, and yet still we have,
weird,
we have the same issues.
It kind of works. And when you don't have a clear view and there's not a massive move amongst the people to change it, it kind of stick with it.
Yeah. Well, it's harder to change it. Yeah, I understand that. So, well, thank you. I think this is going to be very interesting to listeners. And, you know, as we've said, we have listeners all over the world, which is so fun. And I'll bet that it's not just the US people who have some of these thoughts, but maybe from the other countries, even as you mentioned, Japan, where we have quite a few listeners. And Canada, where you still have the queen on the coin, they may be very interested too.
I think Australia has taken the monarch off their notes now, at least.
Yeah.
Nice pictures of kangaroos and wombats.
Yeah. Yeah. So this week, as we reflected on our perceptions, American perceptions of the British, we suggest holding as our main intention, we will that all Americans whose views of their allies may be biased by news, social media, and social group misconceptions will seek to understand the truth of what really happens across the pond, and especially where such conceptions offer a negative or potentially harmful othering of the Britons and Europeans, realizing we're more the same than different.
Yes.
So please join us in holding this intention of unity and togetherness
That's
instead
a
of
nice
separateness.
way to conclude this, isn't it? With that
Yes.
understanding and perhaps, realizing just how much more there is in common.
Mhm.
So that about wraps it up for this episode. Remember, you can connect with us in the Facebook group and for live intention holding in my daily Insight Timer offerings and with Ellen in the Labyrinth Activist Network's Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out too for our next special topic episode, which we'll be releasing in the next few days. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us in holding intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime, thank you, go well, stay safe.
And remember, we're more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Binns and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible or your favorite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.